Harlem. Not a prison yard. Not a crowded street corner. Just a brief, ordinary encounter. The kind that usually disappears the moment it ends. An officer, wearing a uniform backed by law and habit, spoke first. His tone wasn't angry. It wasn't aggressive. It was mocking. A casual remark meant to remind the man standing in front of him who supposedly held the upper hand. That man was Bumpy Johnson. Moments like this rarely become stories. Most end the same way. A sharp reply, an order, a warning, or an escalation that turns routine into paperwork. Authority expects reactions. It depends on them. Without reaction, the hierarchy feels unstable. And that's why the officer expected something back. A look, a word, a shift in tone. What he didn't expect was calm. Bumpy didn't argue. He didn't challenge the badge. He didn't joke back. He responded evenly, without edge, without urgency, as if the remark had arrived already outdated. The answer was short. Ordinary. And yet it landed with enough weight to close the conversation on the spot. No one raised their voice, no line was crossed publicly, but the officer stopped speaking. In encounters like these, the end usually comes from authority asserting itself. This one ended because authority suddenly had nowhere to go next. Continuing would have meant escalating. Backing down would have meant acknowledging the shift. So the only option left was silence. That's what made the moment unforgettable. Not because of what was said, but because of what couldn't be said afterward. In 1958, a calm response didn't just deflect mockery. It quietly demonstrated how a conversation could be ended without confrontation, without force, and without leaving room for a reply. In 1958, a uniform carried automatic authority. An officer didn't need to raise his voice or issue an order to establish control. The badge did that work in advance. Conversations started uneven by default. One side spoke with institutional backing, the other responded within its shadow. Most people adjusted instinctively. They lowered their tone, they explained themselves, or they reacted emotionally and confirmed the imbalance. That was the structure the officer relied on when he spoke to Bumpy Johnson. The mockery wasn't crude. It didn't need to be. It was calibrated. The kind of remark designed to assert dominance without triggering a formal response. A reminder that one man represented the law and the other was expected to acknowledge that fact, if not openly, then at least through behavior. In everyday encounters, this worked. The power of the uniform came from repetition, from the assumption that it would always be deferred to. But authority based on habit has a weakness. It depends on the other person playing along. Bumpy didn't reject the uniform. He didn't challenge it. He didn't undermine it verbally. He simply refused to adjust his posture to it. No defensiveness, no visible tension, no attempt to reclaim status. That neutrality mattered. Because once someone stops reacting the way authority expects, the interaction stops following its usual path. The officer felt it immediately, not as threat, but as disruption. The rhythm was wrong. The hierarchy hadn't been acknowledged, but it also hadn't been attacked. And without either response, the uniform lost its momentum. Authority still existed, but it couldn't advance the conversation. This is the part most people miss about power. It's not absolute. It's conditional on engagement. An officer can command, but he can't force meaning into a calm response. He can escalate, but escalation carries risk. And in a routine encounter, risk is the one thing authority prefers to avoid. By refusing to validate the imbalance, without disputing it, Bumpy exposed the quiet limitation of the badge. It worked best when others cooperated with the script. When they didn't, the next move wasn't obvious. That's when power pauses. And in that pause, the conversation stopped being about law versus individual. It became about who could continue speaking without losing control. The officer's remark wasn't casual. It was positioning. In authority-driven interactions, mockery isn't humor. It's a claim of leverage. A way to say, I can speak this way, and you have to accept it. The tone mattered more than the words. It assumed imbalance. It assumed compliance. That assumption is what Bumpy Johnson declined to confirm. Bumpy didn't challenge the remark directly, because direct challenges invite escalation. He also didn't absorb it, because absorption would have validated the claim behind it. Instead, he answered in a way that stripped the mockery of its function. The response didn't rise to the tone. It didn't mirror it. It didn't correct it. It simply ignored the hierarchy the joke was trying to enforce. That's when the officer's advantage began to evaporate. Mockery only works when it lands somewhere, when it produces embarrassment, anger, or submission. Without that, it hangs in the air unfinished. And unfinished gestures are dangerous for authority because they expose intent without achieving effect. The officer suddenly had a problem. His remark had been heard, but not accepted. A line had been thrown, and it hadn't been caught. At that point, the conversation forked. To continue, the officer would have to escalate, sharpen the tone, invoke the badge explicitly, or turn mockery into command. But escalation turns a casual interaction into a formal one. It creates records, witnesses, consequences, and authority avoids that unless it's necessary. The alternative was to retreat, not visibly, not apologetically, just to stop. That's why the response worked. It didn't defeat the officer. It removed the usefulness of continuing. Any next move would have revealed uncertainty or forced escalation, and neither option benefited the man in uniform. This is the quiet vulnerability of institutional power. It relies on interactions staying within expected boundaries. When someone answers calmly but outside those boundaries, authority has to decide whether the moment is worth turning into something bigger. In this case, it wasn't. The mockery failed not because it was answered harshly, but because it was answered as if it didn't matter. And once mockery loses its effect, it becomes exposure, proof that the claim it carried didn't hold. That's when the conversation stopped being mutual. And that's when the officer realized there was nothing left he could say without changing the nature of the encounter entirely. Calm doesn't look powerful until it interrupts expectation. In encounters shaped by rank, the emotional tempo is usually set by authority. The officer speaks first. The other side reacts. Even silence can be read as submission. But Bumpy Johnson introduced something different. Calm that didn't yield ground and didn't seek it either. That distinction mattered. His response wasn't clever. It wasn't sharp. It didn't signal defiance. It was measured, neutral, and final in tone. The kind of answer that doesn't invite a follow-up. And in authority-driven dialogue, follow-ups are where leverage lives. Without them, control stalls. The officer felt the shift immediately. Calm creates a mirror problem for authority. If the person in front of you isn't agitated, isn't embarrassed, and isn't defensive, then your next move has to manufacture tension. That means raising your voice, asserting the badge explicitly, or turning implication into command. Each of those moves changes the nature of the interaction from casual to consequential. And consequences are expensive. That's why calm works as counter-authority. It forces the other side to decide whether the moment is worth escalating, not whether they can, but whether they should. In this case, the answer was no. The situation hadn't earned it. There were no witnesses demanding action, no rule being openly violated, just a conversation that had stopped producing advantage. What Bumpy did, deliberately or not, was remove urgency from the exchange. Urgency is fuel for authority. Without it, power has to justify itself. And justification is where authority becomes visible, brittle, and sometimes questionable. So the officer hesitated. That hesitation wasn't weakness. It was calculation. Continuing would have required committing to a tone that couldn't be taken back. Ending the conversation quietly preserved control without testing it. Calm had created a fork where one path led to escalation and the other led to disengagement. Authority chose disengagement. This is why the moment ended so cleanly. No winner was declared. No loser acknowledged. But the conversation couldn't continue because it no longer served the person who initiated it. Calm had neutralized the advantage without challenging the structure behind it. And that's the paradox. Calm doesn't overthrow authority. It limits its options. It narrows the field until the safest move is to stop speaking. In 1958, that's exactly what happened, not because power was confronted, but because it was given no productive direction to move next. After the calm response, the conversation entered a dead zone. Not conflict, not resolution, a space where nothing productive could happen next. The officer stood there with options, but none of them worked in his favor anymore. And that's what ended it. To keep talking, he would have needed a reason. Authority doesn't extend itself without cause. Another joke would have sounded forced. Another remark would have felt like provocation. A command would have escalated the encounter beyond what the moment justified. And escalation, once chosen, can't be undone. It creates records, witnesses, explanations. It turns a passing exchange into an event. The officer hadn't planned for that. What made the situation impossible to continue was that Bumpy hadn't given him anything to work with. No disrespect to punish, no defiance to correct, no emotion to control, just a response that closed the loop instead of opening another one. Conversations driven by authority depend on momentum. Once that momentum stalls, authority has to either push hard or step away. Pushing hard carries risk. Stepping away preserves position. That's why the officer stopped. Not because he was defeated, but because continuing would have meant revealing uncertainty. And uncertainty is the one thing authority avoids showing in casual encounters. Silence, in that moment, was the cleanest exit. This is how power actually retreats when it has to, quietly, without explanation, without acknowledgement. Not because it lost, but because it recognized that the terrain had shifted. The conversation had become asymmetrical in the wrong direction. Any further words would have said more than the officer intended. So it ended. No one around needed to comment on it. No one needed to react. The exchange collapsed on its own. And that's what made it so final. There was no echo, no aftershock, just an abrupt absence of dialogue where dialogue had been expected. That absence carried meaning. It signaled that the encounter had reached a point where authority could no longer advance without cost. And in environments governed by calculation, cost determines behavior more than pride. The officer chose the only option that protected his position: disengagement. That's why the conversation ended instantly, not because something dramatic happened, but because nothing useful could happen next. What stayed with people afterward wasn't the officer's remark. It wasn't even the exact wording of Bumpy Johnson's reply. Details like that fade quickly. What didn't fade was the speed and finality with which the exchange ended, and who made that ending inevitable. In most encounters between authority and reputation, the one with the badge decides when things stop. Commands end conversations. Warnings close loops. Silence usually comes last, not first. This moment inverted that logic. The conversation didn't end because the officer asserted control. It ended because control had quietly become unusable. That distinction mattered. Bumpy didn't win the exchange in any theatrical sense. There was no reversal of roles, no public humiliation, no visible submission. Instead, he demonstrated something far rarer: the ability to make further interaction unproductive for the person who initiated it. Once that happened, the outcome was locked. The officer could either escalate into something bigger than intended, or accept the end. He accepted the end, and that choice told everyone who understood power exactly what had happened. Not that authority had been challenged, but that it had been contained. Its range of motion had been reduced to zero without resistance. In power dynamics, that's often more decisive than confrontation. This is why the story endured. It wasn't about disrespect being punished or corrected. It was about how certain responses don't invite continuation. They don't provoke. They don't comply. They close the door without slamming it. And once people see that door close, they remember who had the ability to close it. After 1958, similar encounters took on a different tone. Not louder, quieter. Officers spoke more carefully. Conversations stayed shorter, not out of fear, but out of recognition. Everyone involved understood that some people didn't need escalation to end an exchange. They only needed composure and timing. That's the lesson this moment left behind. Power doesn't always assert itself by pushing forward. Sometimes it asserts itself by deciding that nothing more needs to be said, and making that decision stick. The conversation ended instantly because it had nowhere left to go, and everyone who noticed understood why. What made the moment in 1958 endure wasn't the officer's authority, or even the remark that started the exchange. It was how quickly the situation reached a point where nothing else could be said. No escalation, no retreat worth naming, just an abrupt end that felt deliberate. Bumpy Johnson didn't challenge the badge. He didn't undermine it publicly. He simply responded in a way that removed the usefulness of continuing. In encounters built on hierarchy, that's a rare form of control. It doesn't confront power. It limits it. Authority expects reactions. It depends on them to justify its presence in everyday interactions. When those reactions don't arrive, authority faces a choice: escalate or disengage. In this case, escalation would have cost more than it offered. So the conversation ended. That's why the story lasted. Not because it was loud, but because it was clean. No loose ends. No unresolved tension spilling into something bigger. Just a moment where calm didn't diffuse authority. It outpaced it. Years later, people didn't repeat the words that were spoken. They remembered the silence that followed, the pause that had nowhere to go, the realization that some conversations end not with dominance, but with composure. Power that relies on force leaves marks. Power that relies on control leaves memory. And in 1958, a single calm response was enough to close a conversation, instantly, completely, and without inviting a reply.